So my name is Melody Strmel. I work with Climate Action Reserve, and I can't tell you how excited we are to have this amazing panel here to talk about the impact of a virtual working world on transportation. As you all know, climate change has been massively affected by this pandemic in a multitude of ways, and we're here to talk some more about some of the intricacies of that. I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation and let our panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Repenning, and I work for LA Metro, which is the transportation agency that serves the county of Los Angeles, so about 10 million people in our service area.
Hi there, my name is Brian DePlace. I'm the Director of Service Planning at Sound Transit over in the Puget Sound region, where Seattle is the heart of it, and we are the regional transit authority for the Puget Sound region. Happy to be here today.
Hi, and I'm Polzin. I was working at USDOT up through January of this year on research and technology. My background is civil engineer and academician and researcher in transportation. And I spent a fair amount of the last year looking at the travel impacts resulting from COVID. It's a pleasure to be with you today and look forward to the discussion.
All right, great. And we have some slides for our panelists to further talk about their work and what they have to say about this topic. So we'll start with Heather.
Thank you, Melody. So, this panel is about virtual working world, and it would not be a virtual working world without some type of technology breakdown. So thanks to everyone for bearing with us. I am the Executive Officer of Sustainability Policy at LA Metro. So I'm going to talk in terms of some of the larger themes that we've seen in LA County that relate to working from home, transportation demand, and the recovery. So I wanted to just start with a slide that talks about kind of the early days of the pandemic. And obviously, what we saw in Los Angeles and throughout Southern California were, a lot of people driving a lot less. So a lot of decreases to what we call in the transportation sector, vehicle miles traveled. And so throughout Southern California, we saw a big reduction in the amount of vehicle miles that were being traveled. And if you go to the next slide, that all, appeared to be a really sort of happy thing for air quality in LA County, which historically, we've had a lot of issues. And so, there was a lot of optimism about air quality. We had some really, really beautiful days in LA. You might have seen pictures. But, looking back on it, kind of looking at some of the data and some of the experts seem to agree that a lot of that was as much related to the late spring rain that we got. We had a lot of rain kind of in March and April of last year. And so, that had as much of an impact on air quality as I think the reduction in vehicle miles traveled. So we had these really beautiful days, and folks were, a lot of folks were like, this is what life would be like if we were able to just reduce cars on the road. Now, one of the things that was happening at that time that was a concern is that there was still not a huge reduction in ozone. So ozone, which is related to smog, is produced specifically by heat. So, if you go to the next slide, as springtime waned and we got into to the summer, we ended up with really, really bad smog that was a result, of a lot of really high temperatures, related to climate change, and also because of the wildfires that we've been having here the last few years, statewide wildfires towards the second half of the summer and into the fall, and which are also related to climate change. So we ended up, this is one headline, wildfires made California air quality among the worst in the world, even during the pandemic. So, in spite of all of the telecommuting that was happening and all of the car trips that were being avoided, nonetheless, last year was one of the worst years on record for air quality. And if you go to the next slide, another headline from the LA Times, we began with a clean air streak, but ended with the worst smog in decades. A couple of quotes from the article, region plunged into late spring and summer, intense heat waves, some of the worst ozone pollution readings since the mid-1990s. We also had more than 30 bad air days for fine particle pollution, or soot. If you didn't know that soot was a thing, apparently it is. And some of the highest ozone pollution levels recorded in 26 years. So some pretty bad news in spite of the telecommuting, which really, I think really points out that the work that we have to do in order to really get improved air quality here in California is going to be very hard. And partly it's about our transportation choices, but it's about a lot of other things as well. So going on to the next slide. Back one. Thank you. So one of the things as we look at, side effects of kind of the safer from home protocols are now that we've seen a big boom specifically with Amazon, but there are a lot of other retailers as well, adding warehouse space, specifically in the Inland Empire, kind of on the outside edges of LA County. Right now, a lot of the advocates are focused on trying to get regulators to address warehouses. So we've seen that, Amazon and others have been building these warehouses and really contributing in a very negative way to emissions in those areas, which are a lot of areas that are equity focused, 85% people of color living within a half mile. And, unfortunately, a lot of the warehouses are located near folks that aren't necessarily doing the shopping. So these are some of the other kind of negative impacts of the kind of working from home and people being at home more. Onto the next slide, I wanted to get a little bit into kind of ridership and LA Metro. We're a little bit unique. We're different from some of the big transit agencies that operate in cities like New York or Chicago, in the sense that, our riders in LA are, I believe we have the lowest income ridership of any major metropolitan area. A lot of our folks that take the bus or the train in LA do not have a choice. LA is very much built around the car, which I'll get back to in a couple minutes. But folks who can drive will drive. And so, it's a huge challenge that we have. But what we saw is that we didn't take as big of a hit as some of the other transit agencies that have a lot more, riders by choice and folks who would ride even though they could afford to do other things. So, we did take a really big hit early on, but when things, but we soon kind of stabilized at about 50% of where we were in normal times. And these 50% are essential workers. They're folks that have, needed to continue showing up at their workplace in person, don't have another choices to get around. And so we've been a little bit better off than some other agencies in terms of the loss of our fare box revenue has not been as steep as, I believe Chicago and New York were down 87% in their ridership at, the peak of the pandemic. We've stabilized at around 50%. The other positive that we have at LA Metro is that we have sales tax funding. The voters in LA County approved a couple of different sales tax initiatives. So we have another source of revenue that, yes, was impacted, especially early on when folks, didn't know what the economic impact of the pandemic was going to be. But the sales tax revenue has stabilized since then. So we're not as dependent on fare box revenue as some of the other agencies. So when we talk about kind of the recovery, there's a lot of talk right now about the Biden administration, making, and their infrastructure bill set to make historic investment in mass transit. Some of the big agencies are critically dependent on that, and we are dependent on it as well, maybe a tiny bit less critically. Don't tell our CEO I just said that. The next slide, a couple of other things that kind of, policy themes that I wanted to point out coming through the pandemic. Our CEO kind of in last fall proposed the idea of going fareless in Los Angeles. And for reasons that I just explained, we're less dependent on the fare box. We have a very low income ridership. And so the thinking, and we do have sales tax revenue. So the thinking is that all of the work and cost that goes into collecting revenue, and the revenue that we get, and the idea that paying to ride our system may be prohibitive to people that we would want to start getting on our system. And as we, create new riders, that at the end of the day, it might be easier for us just to be free. So it's a very visionary idea where our board right now is talking about the idea of doing a pilot that would actually start this coming August when school goes back, which would allow through K through 12 and community college students, or maybe all college students, I'm not sure, to ride for free as a pilot. And then the second part of the pilot would kick in early next year, where other low-income residents could ride for free. The pilot would be a couple of years. There's still a lot of ideas being debated, and so this is still really evolving. But I think the sort of focus on equity, the revelation that our essential workers are our core riders, and we absolutely need to support them, I think have led to this particular idea at LA Metro. The other thing that's happened, as in LA, as with a lot of other cities, we've seen street space being used in different ways as we've had less traffic and less, cars to contend with, and a need for more outdoor activities. We've seen, we've had a program called Slow Streets in Los Angeles where neighborhoods can apply to have, their street become one that only, residents are really supposed to access so that it can be, used for, recreation and things like that. We've also seen a lot of restaurants expand out literally into the street. And so the reason that this is important is there's a lot of land use decisions that are going to have to be made if in places like Los Angeles, we get to a point where mass transit is really much more widely adopted. We're going to need to be able to do more bus lanes. We're going to need to be able to do more bike lanes. These are really tough things because folks in LA are really, they don't want to feel that their commute times are being, they're driving to feel like they're going to have to sit in the car for longer because now we've given a lane to a bus. But, I think that this way in which we've made these changes already, I'm hoping will will be something that will continue and allow us to really do what we need to do in LA and get more people using the car, less frequently, single driver car trips, short car trips, and things like that. So those are some of my thoughts coming out of the pandemic, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. That was really so informative. And as a person who lives in LA, just really great to hear about. We're going to move on to Brian, and he's going to tell us about the work that he's been doing with Sound Transit on the other side of the West Coast up in Washington State.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, so we're going to move a little bit farther north here. If we could want to just move to the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm the director of system planning. So that involves all of our service, the planning for service, that's short-term service planning, medium and long-range planning efforts, as well as forecasting ridership, which of course is the great billion-dollar question at this point. I think I'm going to just talk a little bit about some emerging trends we saw during the pandemic, and then kind of talk about what we see as the path forward. A little bit more context: Sound Transit has been in the midst of one of the most ambitious and largest light rail expansions happening in North America right now. That expansion is still happening. So as we are planning for the post-pandemic, we're also planning and still building a pretty massive capital program. Here, this slide shows you what much like other transit agencies, the pretty precipitous drop in ridership. We are, as a regional transit authority, we coordinate with the local authorities, the local transit. So, historically, our rider base has been more commuter oriented. So this is why you see a higher percentage of decline, and pretty much there's been slow upticks in ridership as we've moved through different phases of reopening. We are obviously still in some version of lockdown right now, so we're not seeing a big opening. But as we'll talk about in a few slides, we're anticipating there will be some changes as we move forward. If we could go to the next slide, please. So even though we've seen a pretty big drop in our overall ridership, we've seen a lot more durability in the off-peak, so the very peak commuter riders. That's where we saw the biggest decrease. Not a surprise, obviously Seattle has a pretty heavy tech industry. A lot of those industries were able to transition pretty quickly to a work from home. And that said, there was a lot of durability in our ridership outside of those peak hours. It still had, crowding levels for airport workers, even during the height of the pandemic at, 3 or 4 in the morning. So I think as we are monitoring the trends and looking at the path forward, those are the kinds of all-day service that we would be looking at. As we are, let's transition to the next slide. So as we're looking at what it looks like when employers start to return to work, we're already seeing an increase in traffic congestion. I think, Seattle, like LA, has had historically pretty bad congestion. Right after the pandemic hit, you obviously saw the levels drop pretty quickly. I pulled this data, 3 days ago from the Washington State DOT's website, and as you'll see, traffic levels are already increasing quite a bit. And so as we are, let's go to the next slide. As we are looking at and hearing from major employers about what their return to work plans are, we do anticipate that there will still be a need for transit. So we have, very initial data from working with our downtown Seattle associations who are doing surveys of major employers. We are seeing about, 25-ish% are doing what I'm calling the Amazon model, which is an office-centric return to work policy. 50-ish or more % is doing some version of a hybrid model. Now, what hybrid means, I think we'll start to understand if that's 1 day a week, 4 days a week, that will matter a lot from a transit perspective as we learn more and as employers make their own decisions. Only, less than 10% at this point are thinking they're going to be primarily a remote environment, and then, the remainder are still trying to figure out what the world would look like. So I do say that given sort of the geography and nature of the Puget Sound region, their major drivers of transit will still be there. At the same time, we don't anticipate that the peak will come back in exactly the same way. However, even given now that traffic congestion has increased so much and there's limited parking in our downtown core, our central business district, we anticipate that will drive some of those peak commuters back to transit when the world reopens a little bit more. Let's move to my last slide. So as we're kind of building back from the height of the pandemic, we're going to continue to restore service and prioritize, instead of just running a whole bunch of peak service, we're going to really prioritize our all-day routes that serve a broader market, that also will help serve the essential workers that Heather talked about in the LA area. So I think similar priorities there. The early morning and late evening markets. So I think those are our priorities. That also will help prioritize communities of color that we've seen still using transit even during the height of the pandemic, and that may not be living close to the central business district, but are still using transit to meet their daily needs. So that concludes my part of the presentation. I'll turn it over to the next person, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. It was so great to see how Seattle is dealing with this, especially such a tech-centered city. And now we're going to take more of a view back, and we're going to talk to Stephen, who's been working nationally on these issues.
Thank you, Melody. Interesting time as we see what the consequence of this pandemic are going to be on travel. And if we click to the next slide, I'll set the context here a little bit. This situation is really unique, so the planning world and the transportation analyst world is really struggling to figure out exactly what this is going to mean. It's actually a very unprecedented event. Early on in the pandemic, folks were looking at things like 9/11 Olympics and hurricanes and other things and trying to get some sense of recovery from a impact on transportation. And then as we got into that a little bit longer, people started to realize that the duration and the significance of this impact, the fact that it was national, made it really unique. And that's coupled with the fact that technology has evolved so dramatically over the past many years since some of the prior transportation disruptions. The ability to transition to things like Zoom and Teams meetings, etc., are really unique and unprecedented. So the thinking started shifting with a recognition that, in fact, there will be residual impacts from this contagion that are likely to impact transportation for many years to come. And it's all modes of transportation. Roadway travel was hit the least significantly of any mode during the shutdown periods. Volumes were down 40 or more % in a lot of places. But in contrast to that, shared modes, where you have a higher exposure risk, we're down anywhere from 65 to 90%. Airline travel, public transit, rail, etc., really saw significant impacts. And of course, those not only do you have a different exposure risk, but people can find reasons and alternatives to that. And in fact, lots of people, both from air travelers and transit, did turn to using personal vehicles with record vehicle sales, etc., particularly used vehicles as we started to recover from the pandemic. Next slide, please. This is a graph of commuting behaviors. This is based on the American Community Survey that the census does. And there's a couple of things when you look at this visually is those lines are pretty horizontal. That's a multi-year trend from 2005. And it says that travel behaviors have been relatively consistent over time in terms of the means of commuting to work. The dominant has been personal auto, obviously, relatively stable at about 75% as single occupant vehicles. One that's been declining, which was number 2 historically, was carpooling, shared ride travel. The one that is now in 3rd place pre-pandemic was working at home, telecommuting or not commuting, as it were. Transit was next. That had been usurped by telework in 2019, and bike walk and other have continued at relatively modest shares in spite of a lot of attention that they get from the planning and policy community. For commuting purposes, they've remained relatively modest. The dotted lines in this graph are some estimates and guesstimates of what the post-COVID world might look like. And we happen to have some pretty good data on what happened in 2020 because that year is closed out, although the official census data won't be available till September of this year. But we do know from some surveys that the census and other folks have done that working at home obviously jumped up dramatically in calendar year 2020. The big unknowns, of course, are what's it going to be in 2021 and 2022 and on after that. And to the extent that it's more telecommuting, which modes are going to be losing market share, as it were, to telecommuting? How much of that will be personal auto? How much will be transit, carpool, etc.? And that's a very significant consideration for the planning community as we try and figure out what that means in terms of system ridership, productivity, safety, congestion, emissions, etc. Some very interesting and challenging issues as we face some of those factors as we think about the future. And of course, this is important. We're looking at, expensive infrastructure investments. Obviously, those render value if they're well utilized. So we need to have a pretty good sense of what's going to happen to be making sound investment decisions for particularly fixed asset type investments going forward. Next slide, please. This is some data that the Census Bureau collected. They did a survey every couple weeks during COVID called the Pulse Survey, and they looked at how many people, and this is the blue bars I'm referencing. This is the number of households or the share of households who previously had somebody commuting to work that was now teleworking. And you can see a very dramatic relationship between that and income. And that's not surprising. The information workers tend to be more highly compensated and obviously in a much stronger position to work at home. Their jobs are more conducive to that. So we had very significant shares of telecommuting in high income groups. And during the most of the months of this survey, we were looking at in the neighborhood of a third of the country was working from home, had someone working from home in the household that had previously commuted. Again, this survey is ongoing, but it shows you the magnitude of the change and that fairly unique characteristic how pronounced the income difference is. And when you hear about things like disadvantaged workers and critical workers needing to go to service jobs that you can't shift to information telecommuting, you can see how that would be correlated with compensation and income and explained there. The orange bars happen to be the historic distribution of income for folks that reported working at home in prior years. So next slide, please. This is a significant graph for the public transit folks. On the right-hand side is some August data, which was fairly characteristic. This was after most of the shutdowns were ended, but when we were still most or strong telecommuting and certainly limited travel activity because of ongoing COVID threats. And you'll see a couple of things in that graphic, and one is the very different response between bus and rail. And of course, this is national total data, so each community is unique. And Heather and Brian kind of spoke about characteristics of their communities that differentiate from what might be a national average. But again, a very pronounced difference across modes. The predominant reason for this is rail, at least in a lot of markets, tends to be longer distance, white collar, CBD bound workers who are information workers and are in a position to drive personal vehicles because they're more highly compensated and in a position to have that choice. And two, they also have jobs that are much more conducive to telecommuting so that they wouldn't need to be using public transportation. So again, a very significant and pronounced income difference. The data on the left is some information, again, from the American Community Survey, but it shows the income distribution, the mode choice as a function of income. And you'll see the transit industry has been moving increasingly over time to the point where with this data, it showed a very pronounced bipolar distribution. We have a lot of what has historically been characterized as folks that are transit captives, folks that don't have an alternative, strong use of bus systems, urban trips, urban core, to and from services, jobs, healthcare, etc. And then a lot of higher income folks tending more to be on rail systems, and those tend to be those suburban commutes, perhaps trips to airport on transit, those kinds of things, some special event type things. A lot of our new systems are serving arenas and stadiums and sports venues and convention centers, etc. And so we've got this very unique split in the market characteristics. And again, each of those are influenced differentially because of the COVID situation. Next slide, please. When you think about some of the trends, there's a number of things, and folks at USDOT have done a lot of work on this. A lot of academics are looking at this. There's a lot of survey work being done. There's a lot of people that are analyzing cell phone data and in-vehicle navigation system data and really beginning to understand what's going on in terms of changing travel. There are temporal shifts in demand, meaning travel time patterns are different across the day and across the hours of the day and the days of the week. The morning peak particularly was dampened dramatically, but the afternoon peak was flattened as well. And we've had significant geographic shifts in commuting as well, and in all travel. Most pronounced has been the urban cores are seeing a much weaker relative travel strength. Folks are saying that within the last month, total volume of roadway travel is back to pre-pandemic levels, but it certainly isn't in some urban core areas, most urban core areas. A lot of that travel is travel on other parts of the system, including the suburban, exurban, and rural systems. A lot of it is catch-up social recreation travel, what some characterize as revenge travel. And we're seeing some redistributions because of that. Similarly, as you break that work-home commute pattern, all of a sudden some of your other activities, shopping, etc., are more neighborhood or residential location centric and not necessarily along that work-to-home commute path that you might have used as a focus of a lot of your activities historically. The big challenge will be central business districts because they have concentrations of office work that's much more conducive to telecommuting. You're seeing lots of stories about office vacancy and repositioning office space. We're likely to see softer congestion levels in urban cores for some period of time, including less urban congestion for commuters and less parking pressures than heretofore. We're seeing strong evidence of what they characterize as this hybrid commuting pattern. The verdict remains to be seen as to how that plays out and its implications, but there's an awful lot of, work in the office 2 days a week to retain the culture of the workplace, but telecommute 3 days a week. And of course, from a transportation planning and analysis perspective, it's going to be very important to understand which days of the week and what that pattern looks like. And of course, the challenge is as we build and operate services and build infrastructure, it gets very expensive to build for peaks. If you're only running buses full 2 and 3 days a week versus 5 in a kind of a historic work trip pattern, that becomes a real challenge in terms of productivity, efficiency, and ultimately environmental implications. It does, and I've authored some other papers looking at this issue, it does present some very real challenges to public transportation going forward. This is an unprecedented change in behavior. The technology has really enabled some significant replacement of travel with communication substitution, and how that plays out is going to be important to understand going forward. There is the expectation that some of those time and money saved on commuting will be redeployed in other travel. So from an environmental perspective, it remains to be seen what the total impact is likely to be. But there's already some evidence of what we call revenge travel or catch-up travel. And also there's a meaningful shift of what used to be airline travel to personal vehicle travel. And that's a significant explanatory factor in how the total VMT has recovered as much as it has, because we are seeing what used to be air travel, particularly short air trips, are conducive to shifting to automobile as well. And that'll be another kind of phenomenon and trend to watch and explore its impacts in terms of environment and other considerations. Those are some of the issues. Each mode is different and each geography has unique characteristics, but we're not through this yet in terms of learning from it and understanding. And there does appear to be an emerging consensus that we're very unlikely to return to what 2019 was the pre-COVID normal. The post-COVID is not going to be like 2019. Just how different it's going to be remains to be seen. But I think the consensus of a lot of experts is it's definitely going to be different than what we were seeing pre-COVID. So with that, I'll quit speaking here and open it up for discussion and questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Stephen. That was really interesting to see how national trends are, meeting with individual cities. So we have some questions in the Q&A, but first I want to talk with you about some general ideas about transit and what your thoughts are on these. So we've been talking a lot about personal transit, but one of the transportation that we haven't really discussed is transit that's used for trade and items. I mean, Heather, you brought that up a little bit when you talked about Amazon and the Inland Empire, but I'd like to hear more from all of you about how you think transportation of goods and other things is going to be affected by the virtual world.
I'll be glad to take a shot at that, Heather. There was the expectation, in addition to telecommuting, the other kind of significant phenomenon is the e-commerce side of that, where people weren't shopping and they were having stuff delivered and meals, obviously, and those kinds of things. And there are people that quickly wonder if, you know, the mileage that's created by that delivery offsets or more than offsets the savings of not going shopping, etc. And again, I think the verdict's out on that, but I do think there's a couple of aspects of that are intriguing. If you're doing online shopping, for example, and that means there's another box on the Amazon truck that takes its route tomorrow, and that truck might have 200, 300, 400 packages in it, the incremental environmental mileage or attributable mileage for that kind of transaction might be relatively modest. On the other hand, the travel intensive substitutions are things like just-in-time or meal deliveries or grocery deliveries with a 2-hour window, where the mileage both to and from the place of purchasing is attributable to a decision or a purchase that you've made, and that mileage then is much more significant because it's being in effect amortized over one purchase instead of over a vehicle full of boxes, etc. So when you think of this from an environmental perspective, those are very energy intensive decisions. If we want just in time or a meal delivered through DoorDash or Uber or what have you, that's a fair amount of extra mileage or mileage per purchase, not necessarily different than had you gone to the restaurant and back, but non-trivial relative to consumption that comes in a scheduled delivery vehicle, like a product that you'd purchase through the Postal Service or FedEx or Amazon or something like that.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I honestly didn't even think about how grocery delivery and other increases like that were affecting transportation needs, but obviously that's a huge component. Do you want to weigh in, Brian or Heather, at all?
I can talk a little bit. Having spent 10 years working at our local DOT, I have some insights on how deliveries will impact. I think from Stephen, I have to agree with what he said. I think in urbanized environments, which is more what I'm familiar with, I think the incremental add of online shopping, it probably has a pretty negligible effect. I do anticipate, and you'll see this in a lot of urban areas, this kind of move to the 15-minute city. So as opposed to sort of focusing on our core business districts, the downtown business district. And Seattle's already set itself up in this way. You have neighborhood business districts, and I think you'll find more walking and amenities within sort of a certain walkshed of an urban area. And so when, at least in Seattle, we're still hovering between 25 and 50% occupancy of our restaurants and other issues like that. So I think when those restrictions get lifted, I don't anticipate huge impacts for DoorDash and Uber beyond what we were sort of already doing pre-pandemic. There was already a market for that. It may increase somewhat, but I don't think it'll be nearly at the level that it is now. I think people, especially in urban areas, like to be out with other people. That's one of the reasons why we are starting to go into a fourth wave, is that people are wanting to socialize and be around other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Melody, just let me add a quick comment on that. A number of years ago, I looked into some of the environmental implications of e-commerce. And at that point in time, some of the emerging literature was suggesting that the packaging materials and the environmental impact from the packaging was more significant than the incremental transportation impact. And when you look at the number of Amazon boxes some houses get, you can start to see how the resources consumed to produce that might be meaningful as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have so many more things I could ask you and want to talk about, but I also we have a little less than 15 minutes, and I do want to get to the questions that our attendees have asked. We have a question about safety on transit. So the question is, given what seems like a greater economic divide post-pandemic, will safety on transit be a bigger concern now? Any plans in place to increase security? Do you think that potentially going fareless would decrease or increase security? And is this a cost that we need to think about when we're thinking about post-pandemic transit? Oh, Heather, I think you're still muted. Maybe try refreshing the browser. Sorry, folks, just 1 second. Virtual workplaces.
Maybe I can talk for a second. I do think that's a good question. A lot of West Coast cities, and I'm sure East Coast cities also have, the economic impacts of the pandemic have obviously caused a huge surge in homelessness. Many of the unsheltered do use transit as a way of having safe shelter. So that is an issue that we're having to struggle with. So I think that's a kind of an issue to be monitored as people start to return and to see kind of how it evens out. I think Seattle, as with other places, are grappling with the racial disparity and equity impacts of having too heavy-handed enforcement. So I would want to really make sure that we are not overcorrecting by criminalizing certain behavior and things like that. So maybe some of this can get handled by sort of the transit version of eyes on the street, where you have a kind of a critical mass of people on the facilities, and some of the issues that are identified are mitigated. I think we'll know more once we start to see more people return to just general life.
Yeah.
Melody, let me add a little bit to that as well. I agree with Brian's thinking on that. One of the risks we do have is when you're riding transit, obviously you take comfort if there's a group of people. People always feel safer in a group. And they feel safer in a group if there's other people like them. And that could be racial, ethnic, socio-demographic, etc. That's just human nature. So to the extent that our markets get thinner and or more polarized by income, that is a risk of being a factor that could influence behaviors as it relates to using transit going forward. The no fare concept is, as Brian indicated, that's getting a lot of attention. And remember, transit travelers are only paying, at least nationally, about 15% of the total capital and operating cost of their trip. And the vast majority of seniors and disadvantaged folks and students, et cetera, already ride at half that fare. So it's a highly discounted service to begin with. But certainly there's other folks that would benefit from having free transportation. The trade-off has always been identifying mechanisms that can sort through who's eligible, and also this risk that you're going to have people using transit for shelter, or kids using it and scaring away seniors, and et cetera, et cetera. And so those are some downside risks, and the sensitivity to enforcement is such that that those could become issues and problems that could deter other folks from traveling. And places like San Francisco, for example, have already seen, some evidence that conditions in stations and platforms and vehicles are deterring people from wanting to use the service. So there is a balance there. You do need to keep them safe and clean to attract particularly choice travelers.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And speaking of, and hopefully Heather will come back and offer her thoughts as well. But, speaking of transit equity. Have either of you, either in your city or nationally, heard? Oh, Heather, you're back. We can hear you.
Hi, everyone. I'm back. What did I miss?
Just Brian and Stephen giving some really great insight into safety and security in transit in a post-pandemic world.
Let me just jump in really quickly. I mean, we've been having the same conversation at LA Metro that a lot of cities have been having, where, normally we contract out services to, LAPD or LA County Sheriff. And I think a lot of folks are wanting to see, is there a way to provide, quote unquote, safety that doesn't necessarily involve the use of sort of armed officers. And so I know we're looking at programs that would include more ambassadors. And I think that it may be a way to do more inexpensively, or maybe some combination. I'm not in depth in that discussion, but I think it could be, an interesting trend in public transit. LA obviously has the same issues that I caught a little bit of the conversation in terms of homelessness, and that's, it's a challenge that I think is facing all of our systems right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And, speaking of issues facing all of our transit systems, and speaking of, making sure that it's a safe and equitable place for everyone to use, I know that you mentioned, Heather, potentially going fareless. Beyond those, have you seen any programs that are to help lower income and disadvantaged communities who do use a lot of the transit because they have to, and not necessarily because they have a choice?
Well, I think one of the big, ways to help essential workers, folks that are really dependent on our system, is improved service, and making sure that we're able to provide service that doesn't require folks to wait for a long time to catch their bus. And so, we're undertaking what they call the next gen bus, the reorganization of our bus service at LA Metro. I think the other big thing that, is a part of this is really federal investment. And, Biden's infrastructure plan invests a lot more heavily in public transit than historically the federal government has done. And invests a lot less in new roads and highways. It definitely does infrastructure repairs. But I think that, we have really, it looks like for the next 4 years, the federal government as a real partner. I know there was an audience question about kind of cutting service and reducing service and things like that. I mean, I think what we're all trying to avoid is having to keep cutting back service, because we have fewer riders to the point where we're really in a tailspin, and then the service is bad, and then no one can take it anymore. And so I think really trying to make sure that we have, efficient service is a really important part of being able to serve the community.
I have to say I agree 100% with what Heather said, and I think that frequent and reliable service is really the key. I think it's some of the challenges we had during the depth of the pandemic. We had to cut service so quickly, and part of it was due not because of the lack of ridership, but because of our lack of available operators, right? And so what that did is it transitioned relatively frequent service, and suddenly it became lifeline service. So now it was operating every 30 minutes or every hour. And now if you're an essential worker, not like me, if I'm late to work, it doesn't matter, right? But if you're an essential worker and you miss that bus, now you got to wait another hour, right? That's huge, right? So I think that the more we can create 15-minute service or below, frequencies that are faster than that, that starts to mitigate some of those issues of you miss one, well, the next one's right around the corner. If there's a lot of traffic issues, you have shadow buses that can kind of come behind and pick up people. So I think that really investing in reliable service is one of the best things we can do for communities that are relying on transit.
Melody, let me offer just a thought on that, and they're absolutely correct in terms of the public's aspirations, and perhaps even more so than historically. It's a kind of just-in-time generation and mindset, and time doesn't discriminate. Everybody, regardless of income and other characteristics, has that same 24 hours and packs it full of different activities, in terms, including childcare and work and education, etc. So everybody really likes high quality, frequent service. The challenge that the transit industry faces from an environmental perspective is empty buses aren't energy efficient. You need a volume, you need high occupancy to really capture the benefits of, quote, mass transportation. And nationally right now, we've got about 10 people on a bus on average, and 20 plus, 22, 3, 4 on a light rail system on average. And those are already numbers that, in terms of energy efficiency, aren't very compelling. An efficient auto can best those in many cases. Again, each urban environment is different. Those numbers don't apply to some of the larger cities. But as an industry, it's a challenge. If we ramp up the supply and we don't have a corresponding increase in demand, we're not going to be making the contribution that everybody'd like to see made in terms of environmental impact. I wish I had the answer. If I did, I'd be rich. But it's a real challenge for the transit industry going forward, of kind of weaving the needle between being responsible both fiscally, environmentally, and meeting the needs of customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there are just so many different sides to this issue and so many coordination things, both federally and locally. Are any of you working on intercity partnerships or see how different metro areas or even like urban and more rural areas are working together to sort of make sure that they're on the same page and that transit can move forward from the pandemic?
Well, at LA Metro, we serve 88 different cities in LA County. So it's a real part of the dynamic. Cities obviously control land use. And I think one of the key, things that cities and transportation agencies, should be able to work together on is land use planning and making sure that housing is located, near transit, making sure, as I talked earlier about street space and creating opportunities to prioritize transit, using our, public right of way, that, creating space for other modes to exist. I think these are all really key issues. And I think that, there's a lot of work to be done there in terms of being able to plan together.
Absolutely. Well, our panel is officially over. We do have one last question. If one or two or three of you have the time to answer it, and then we can wrap up. People were wondering sort of how vaccines and safety around pandemic things, if that's like viable at all. Do you foresee sort of any sort of like vaccine passport things with public transit, or do you think it's just too hard to?
I can say at this point that's not something that Sound Transit is contemplating. I think even during the pandemic, obviously, along with every other transit agency, masking was required. We, try and have some modicum of social distancing, depending on the service. That's more or less successful. All that said, transmission rates for our bus operators were below the regional average. Transmission rates have not been seen to be happening on transit as as a source. So at this point, it's not a huge concern for us. I think as we start to move towards hopefully something that looks like herd immunity, that will start to solve the problem in and of itself. And I think we'll continue to take our cues from the CDC in terms of masking and distancing and things like that. So I don't think that's, for us, that's not something in the cards. I think also just the being able to monitor that and have operators try to enforce that would put a pretty undue burden and require significant negotiations with the transit union, as well as slow down our boarding process and I think issues like that. So at this point, not you know, I think we would be looking towards how it's impacting the rest of the community, and then taking our cues from that.
Yeah. Melody, earlier in the COVID situation, the American Public Transit Association put together a program for agencies to join that would kind of certify cleaning protocols. And I don't know, you know, how much attention that got. I think as time moved on, there was a recognition that surface transmission was not that significant of a contributor to transmission versus the aerial. And I think Brian's correct in that both domestically and internationally, transit hasn't been shown to be a significant spreader. I think the piece that would concern folks are, you know, we have had distancing on transit and very low utilization rates, so that you could socially distance on transit. The idea of crush loads, peak period crush loads, where you're, you know, person to person in the aisle, that might continue to scare people. And like every phenomenon, there's going to be some percent of the population that will be scared for years. It might only be 2 or 3%, but there will be some people that will be perpetually scared of transmission of the next variant or the next pandemic, and that will deter their comfort levels in using shared modes. And we'll have to see the magnitude of that. Again, I think in kind of national terms, but you don't want to lose any percent of your market if you can help it. And clearly there's going to be some segment of the market that will remain risk averse and choose not to use particularly crowded services. And that doesn't mean just transit, that, you know, airlines and other things. There's going to be some share of the market that's not going to return to normal for some significant period of time.
I would just weigh in as well. I would agree with Brian. I mean, we're not going to make anything. I don't think we're going to go down the road of doing anything to make it harder for people to use our system right now. And you know, in LA, we're actually, I think we've already, our COVID rates, because we got hit so hard in the winter, you know, between vaccination and the number of people who already had it, we're at like 0.8% of test positivity. So I think I don't see vaccination passports for public transit in the immediate future.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for coming and speaking here and answering all our questions about the future of public transportation, which is so essential to, you know, having a net zero or net neutral carbon world in the future. Do any of you have closing thoughts that you want to say before we end our panel? Ryan, we'll start with you. And if not, that's fine. We can just wish everyone a lovely day. And
I think we kind of hit on it. I mean, I think we're all trying to take a snapshot in time right now and look forward. So, you know, we're actually not out of the pandemic yet. So these are really based on our best professional assumptions, and we'll see, you know, so a lot of it's a wait and see. Let's see what happens. I don't think anything I said here should be definitive, but more like a planning assumption from which we can then deviate as the world changes around us.
Absolutely. We're still in such a period of flux and uncertainty. Stephen, last words?
Yeah, just a couple thoughts. There's an awful lot of research being done across the country, and a lot of folks sharing their experiences. And I'd encourage folks that are interested in this to seek that out. There's a number of universities that have webinars and surveys and training sessions, etc. There's There's a significant publication that's in the National Transportation Library about COVID impacts on travel. Bureau of Transportation Statistics is producing a lot of information on a special COVID page that monitors trends of what's going on across the modes. And so there is a lot of information out there, and I encourage folks to take advantage of it, and obviously share your lessons learned in some of the unique urban environments as well. And if I can be of service to anybody and point them in the right directions or help them, be glad to help folks out. Thanks.
Well, that's lovely. Thank you so much, Stephen. Heather, last words?
Sure. And great job, by the way, for becoming the moderator under, these circumstances, Melody. But I just wanted to, since this is North American Carbon World, we've been talking about telecommuting as something that is a threat to public transit, which, public transit is a good thing for our fight against climate change. But telecommuting itself is actually really, I think, a positive thing. It takes cars off the road, and so how do we keep telecommuting and support for telecommuting, encourage businesses to continue policies that promote decreasing VMTs, which is good for the environment. That isn't a threat to our public transit system. And I think, looking at, for LA, where, the fact that we don't have, the same gridlock that we're used to, is there a way now to repurpose some of the space that we have on streets like that, for example, to make it easier for people to access our public transit system, is one way to think of them, not in opposition, but as, something potentially that could support each other. But I appreciate everyone's time here today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Heather. Thank you so much, Brian and Stephen. This was such a pleasure to talk to you. So interesting and informative. As a transit writer, I feel so much more equipped to think about my future using transit, and I hope that everyone here has also been equally enlightened. I hope that all three of you and all of our attendees have a wonderful day, and thank you so much.